The slap came so fast that for a second I thought someone had dropped a glass behind me. Instead, it was my mother's hand across my face. The ballroom fell silent. More than 300 guests stood frozen beneath crystal chandeliers, champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips. Politicians, business executives, journalists, people who had spent years praising my family for their generosity, watched as my mother took a step back and looked at me as though I were a stranger who had wandered in from the street. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. A few people turned away awkwardly. Others didn't even try to hide their curiosity. Across the stage, my father adjusted his tuxedo jacket and sighed into the microphone. "Claire," he said, shaking his head, "haven't you embarrassed this family enough?" The audience chuckled nervously. 12 years. For 12 years, I had been the disgrace of the Dawson family, the daughter who had supposedly stolen confidential records from the family's charity foundation before disappearing without explanation. That was the story everyone believed, and judging by the expressions around me that night, nobody expected to hear anything different. Two security guards started walking toward me. My mother folded her arms. My younger brother stood beside her, refusing to meet my eyes. My father smiled politely to the donors seated near the stage, already certain that this would be one more public humiliation to strengthen the story they had spent years carefully constructing. What none of them knew was that I hadn't come to apologize. Hidden inside my purse was a small flash drive that had taken federal investigators 8 months to build, and before the night was over, everything they had spent decades protecting would begin to collapse. But to understand why I came back, you need to know what happened 12 years earlier. Back then, people called my father the most generous businessman in the state. Richard Dawson built an empire that stretched across construction companies, investment firms, and most importantly, the Dawson Foundation. Newspapers loved him. Television hosts invited him onto their shows. Every few months, another photograph appeared online showing him shaking hands with politicians beside oversized checks destined for hospitals, schools, or disaster relief programs. At home, however, things worked differently. The Dawson family had one rule above all others: protect the family name. Truth came second. I learned that lesson when I was 24. At the time, I had just finished graduate school and started helping organize records for the foundation. Most of the work was boring, sorting invoices, reviewing budgets, answering emails. But one evening, while preparing documents for an annual audit, I noticed several payments that didn't make sense. Millions of dollars had been transferred to consulting companies I'd never heard of. At first, I assumed there had been a mistake. I spent days checking contracts, tax records, and payment histories, expecting to find an explanation. Instead, the deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. The companies shared addresses, the invoices looked almost identical, and large donations intended for children's hospitals seemed to disappear before ever reaching their destination. I remember sitting alone in my office long after everyone had left, staring at my computer screen while rain tapped against the windows. I wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation. The next morning, I walked into my father's office carrying a folder filled with documents. He listened quietly while I explained what I had found. For several seconds after I finished speaking, he said nothing. Then he opened a drawer and placed a stack of approval forms on his desk. He said, "Sign these." I frowned. "What are they?" "Routine paperwork." I flipped through the pages. My signature would authorize every transaction I had questioned. I looked back at him, certain that I had misunderstood. "You want me to approve this?" My father leaned back in his chair. "Claire, families survive because they trust each other." Even now, years later, I still remember how ordinary his voice sounded. No anger, no threats, just certainty. When I refused, his expression changed for the first time. He stood up, walked to the window, and said something I would never forget. "Think very carefully about what happens next." I wish I could tell you that I understood the warning. I didn't. because less than 24 hours later, my entire life had been rewritten. By morning, relatives were calling to ask whether the rumors were true. Friends stopped answering my messages. Employees at the foundation avoided looking at me. Someone had told everyone I had stolen confidential records and disappeared with charity money. And somehow, almost overnight, people believed it. The worst part wasn't losing my job. It wasn't packing my clothes into a single suitcase. It wasn't even watching my parents stand silently while my reputation was destroyed. The worst part was realizing how quickly people abandon you when the truth becomes inconvenient. That afternoon, I walked out of the house where I had spent my entire life. I stood on the sidewalk with one suitcase and less than $400 in my bank account. As the front door closed behind me, I kept telling myself that eventually the truth would come out. I had no idea that my family was already preparing for something much bigger, and years later, one unexpected visitor would prove just how far they had gone. For the first few months after leaving home, I measured time by overdue bills. I rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat on the other side of the city. The pipes rattled at night, the walls were so thin that I could hear my neighbors arguing, and every Friday I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, trying to decide which expense could wait another week. The stories about me spread faster than I ever imagined. Former classmates stopped returning my calls. People I'd known since childhood crossed the street when they saw me coming. Online, strangers repeated rumors they had heard from someone who knew someone connected to the Dawson Foundation. According to them, I had stolen money from children's hospitals. I had betrayed my own family. I had disappeared because I was guilty. For a long time, I wanted to defend myself. I drafted emails that I never sent and rehearsed conversations that never happened. But every lawyer I spoke to gave me the same advice. Without proof, you'll lose. And they were right. The Dawsons had money, influence, and a carefully protected reputation. I had a suitcase, a part-time job, and a version of the truth that nobody wanted to hear. So I stopped trying to convince people. Instead, I started over. During the day, I worked wherever I could find work. I spent 6 months as a receptionist at a dental clinic. After that, I moved to an insurance company, processing paperwork for customers I would never meet. At night, I attended law school, often surviving on coffee and whatever food was cheapest that week. There were moments when I nearly gave up. Once, during my second year, my car broke down on the highway while I was driving home from class. I remember sitting in the driver's seat after midnight, rain hitting the windshield, wondering whether my father had been right all along. Maybe life would have been easier if I had signed those documents. Maybe integrity was just another word people used when they couldn't afford compromise. But every time those thoughts appeared, I remembered the hospitals that never received their funding and the families who trusted my father's foundation to help them. And somehow, that was enough to keep going. Years passed. Slowly, the rumors faded. Not because people discovered the truth, but because they found newer scandals to discuss. I graduated, joined a financial crimes unit, and built a career investigating fraud cases that looked surprisingly familiar. Most people in my office knew almost nothing about my family. I preferred it that way. The less I talked about the Dawsons, the easier it became to pretend that chapter of my life had ended. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, someone knocked on my office door. I almost told my assistant to send them away. I was buried in paperwork and preparing for a hearing the next morning. But something in her expression made me pause. "She says she used to work for your father's foundation." The words hit me harder than I expected. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 60s stepped into my office carrying an old leather bag. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She had been an accountant for the Dawson Foundation for nearly 15 years. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that comes from carrying the same secret for too long. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me," she said quietly. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "What can I do for you?" For several seconds, she simply stared at her hands. Then she opened her bag and placed a flash drive on the table between us. I think your father is preparing for another audit, and this time he's planning to leave someone else with the blame. I felt my stomach tighten. Margaret explained that over the years, she had watched millions of dollars disappear through consulting firms that existed only on paper. Donations intended for hospitals, scholarship programs, and emergency shelters were being rerouted into shell companies controlled by people close to my father. At first, she convinced herself that she was mistaken. Then she stopped asking questions because she was afraid of losing her job. But recently, she had discovered internal emails suggesting that records were being destroyed ahead of a government review. I couldn't stay silent anymore, she said. I picked up the flash drive. Why bring this to me? She looked directly at me for the first time. Because I think they were planning to blame you from the beginning. I didn't answer. Part of me wanted to believe she was wrong. Another part already knew she wasn't. That night, long after everyone else had left the office, I sat alone in a conference room with two forensic investigators, opening encrypted files that nobody outside the foundation had seen. Bank transfers, fake invoices, consulting agreements signed by companies that didn't exist. The evidence stretched back years, and with every document we uncovered, one question became impossible to ignore. If my family had built such an elaborate system, why had they worked so hard to destroy my reputation 12 years earlier? Around midnight, one of the investigators stopped scrolling. "Claire," he said carefully, "you need to look at this." He turned his laptop toward me. At first, the document seemed ordinary, another financial authorization, another transfer between accounts. Then I saw the signature, my signature, or at least a version of it. The date was from 3 years after I had left home. Someone had forged my name to approve one of the largest transactions in the foundation's history. For several seconds, nobody in the room spoke. Margaret lowered her eyes. One investigator quietly asked whether I had ever signed anything remotely similar. I shook my head. And in that moment, something became painfully clear. My family hadn't simply destroyed my reputation to protect themselves. They'd spent years building the perfect escape plan. If anyone ever uncovered the fraud, there would already be a villain waiting. Me. The room fell silent again as the investigators began discussing warrants, subpoenas, and financial records. But I barely heard them. Because for the first time in 12 years, I understood what my father had meant when he warned me to think carefully about what happened next. He hadn't been protecting the family, he was protecting himself. And somewhere in thousands of files scattered across conference room tables, we had just found the first proof that could bring everything down. What we didn't know yet was that exposing the truth would require us to walk straight into the one place I had promised myself never to return. The investigation lasted 8 months. Officially, nothing was happening. The Dawson Foundation continued hosting charity dinners, cutting ribbons in front of cameras, and posting photographs of smiling children on social media. My parents gave interviews about generosity and civic responsibility. My mother chaired fundraising committees. My brother attended conferences and talked about the family's commitment to public service. Privately, everything was changing. Federal investigators traced bank transfers across 3 countries. Accountants reconstructed years of financial records. Search warrants were drafted and revised. Every invoice, every email, every suspicious payment had to be verified. The process was painfully slow. There were days when I wondered whether anything would ever happen at all. Then, in early spring, one of the lead investigators called me into a meeting. "We're ready," he said. I looked around the room. Folders covered the table. A timeline stretched across an entire wall. Ready for what? He slid a file toward me. The Gala. For nearly 20 years, the Dawson Foundation's annual charity gala had been the most important event on my parents' calendar. Politicians attended, reporters covered it, rich donors competed for seats near the stage.
To the public, it was proof that the Dawson family cared about something bigger than money. Investigators saw it differently. One night, hundreds of witnesses, every important donor in one room, no opportunity to rewrite the story afterwards. I understood the strategy immediately. That didn't make it easier. For 12 years, I had avoided every invitation, every holiday gathering, every article that mentioned my family's name. Now I was being asked to walk back into the center of the world that had rejected me. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later. My mother's handwriting covered the envelope. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and read the card 3 times. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even warm. It simply informed me that despite our unfortunate history, my presence at the gala would demonstrate family unity. I laughed when I finished reading it. After everything that happened, they still believed appearances mattered more than truth. The night of the event, the Dawson estate looked exactly as I remembered. Valets hurried across the driveway, music drifted through open windows. Guests stepped out of expensive cars and disappeared beneath strings of golden lights. For a few seconds, I stayed inside my own car. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I thought about turning around. Then I remembered the forged signature. I remembered Margaret. I remembered every person who had trusted my father's foundation with their donations. And I walked inside. The ballroom was even larger than I remembered. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting soft light over hundreds of guests. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne. Near the stage, cameras flashed as reporters photographed my parents. Nobody noticed me at first. Then someone whispered my name.
Conversion slowed. Heads turned. I saw recognition spread from table to table. The disgraced daughter had returned. My mother spotted me before anyone else. For a moment, surprise crossed her face. Then came anger. She crossed the room quickly, her smile disappearing with every step. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I held up the invitation. "You invited me. You should have known better." People nearby pretended not to listen. My father approached us, still wearing the expression he reserved for photographers and donors. "Claire," he said, softly, "this isn't the place." I almost laughed. For 12 years, there had never been a place. Not at family dinners, not at holidays, not in private conversations. There had only been silence. "I'm not here to cause problems," I replied. My mother looked around at the guests gathering nearby. Then, without warning, she slapped me. The sound echoed across the ballroom. The music stopped. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then security started toward us. My father sighed and shook his head as though he were witnessing a tragedy he had tried to prevent. "Please escort her outside," he told them. One of the guards reached for my arm, and then the ballroom doors opened. At first, most guests didn't understand what they were seeing. Several men and women entered carrying folders and identification badges. Behind them came investigators, attorneys, and uniformed officers. The lead agent stepped forward. "Richard Dawson." My father froze. The room fell silent. "We have federal warrants authorizing the seizure of financial records connected to an ongoing fraud investigation involving the Dawson Foundation." No one spoke. My mother's face drained of color. My brother stared at the officers as if he expected someone to explain that this was all a misunderstanding. It wasn't. Within minutes, investigators moved toward the stage. Technicians connected equipment to the giant screens hanging above the ballroom. The first image appeared, a hospital construction project that had never been completed. Then another, scholarship funds redirected through shell companies, emergency relief donations transferred into luxury real estate accounts. Gasps spread through the crowd. Guests who had spent years writing checks to the foundation watched millions of dollars vanish into businesses secretly controlled by my family. My father recovered first. "This is absurd," he said loudly. "You've been misled by disgruntled employees." My mother blamed accountants.
My brother blamed consultants. For a moment, the excuses came so quickly that some guests almost seemed willing to believe them. Then the final piece of evidence arrived. An investigator pressed a button. My father's voice filled the ballroom. The recording had been recovered from company servers months earlier. If anyone starts asking questions, use Claire's name. People already believe she disappeared with the money. The silence that followed felt endless. I watched donors lower their eyes. Board members stepped away from my parents. Reporters rushed toward the exits, phones already in their hands. 12 years of lies collapsed in less than a minute. By sunrise, every major news outlet in the country carried the story. Within days, sponsors withdrew funding. Members of the foundation's board resigned. Federal prosecutors announced charges involving fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and the destruction of financial records. My brother accepted a plea agreement and admitted his role in creating false invoices. My mother was charged with falsifying donor reports. My father spent months insisting that he had done nothing wrong. The courts disagreed. The Dawson Foundation was dissolved, and much of the recovered money was redirected to the hospitals, shelters, and scholarship programs it had been stolen from. People often assume that was the moment I finally felt victorious. It wasn't. Justice is quieter than revenge. There was no celebration waiting for me when the trials ended, no dramatic sense that the past had been erased. There was only relief. Months later, I received a letter from my mother. She wrote that she had simply followed my father's decisions. She said she regretted the distance between us. She asked whether someday I could forgive her. I folded the letter, placed it back into the envelope, and put it away. Some apologies are born from genuine regret. Others arrive only after consequences do. Learning the difference changed my life. People still ask whether exposing my own family was worth it. The truth is, I didn't destroy the Dawson name. I simply stopped protecting the lies that had built it. Justice never gave me back the years I lost, or the family I once believed I had, but it gave me something more valuable, my own name, and the freedom to carry it without shame. If you've ever had to choose between loyalty and the truth, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what choice you made. Because one thing I've learned is this: no matter how powerful people become, every lie has an expiration date. And when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't knock. It walks straight through the front door.